Story 1. Marion Bachmeier shot the man who raped and murdered her 8-year-old daughter in the courtroom during his trial. She received a 6-year sentence and was released after 3 years. Story 2. The murder of your children. Story 3. Jean Valjean's crime was stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving child. Story 4. This concerns the killing of the man who sexually assaulted your daughter. He had been released on bail and then lured her out of her house again. Also include the public humiliation of the judge who unsuccessfully tried to impose a gag order on the case, since she was the one who originally released the man on a measly $50,000 bond. This is the Aaron Spencer case. Story 5. Stealing food for survival. If you were my girlfriend and steal food off my plate, I do not understand it and find it unforgivable. I will slap your hand. Story 6. Let's say your child is molested or the other parent dates or marries someone who abuses them. If that parent came in and killed the perpetrator and the neglectful parent, I would understand. If you put me on that jury, I would vote not guilty even if they had nailed them to a cross. Story 7. Former Ultimate Fighting Championship champion Cain Velasquez tried to shoot the man who raped his stepson. I understand he endangered people while pursuing the man and that he broke the law, but I completely understand why. Story 8. Let me tell you about this man, Brian Thompson, former Chief Executive Officer of United Healthcare. There are plenty of stories. United Health Group reportedly paid nursing homes secret bonuses to prevent or delay medically necessary hospital transfers of Medicare Advantage patients. United Health Group allegedly required a surgeon to scrub out of a pre-approved surgery so that he could answer questions about whether a different patient's surgery was necessary. United Healthcare has the highest claim denial rate among health insurance companies. United Healthcare defrauded Medicare of billions of dollars. United Health Group was ordered to pay $165 million in fines for deceptive sales schemes. United Health Group used algorithms to routinely deny covered therapy despite multiple states ruling it illegal. United Health Group denied children with autism critical treatments. The Federal Trade Commission sued United Health Group for inflating insulin prices. These people are scum. They almost certainly have caused the deaths of thousands and the unnecessary suffering of hundreds of thousands, and their leadership appears to be entirely above the law. I do not approve of vigilantism or murder, but I believe that a better justice system would have eventually severely punished Thompson and those around him. Story 9. Anytime I read a headline about a Florida man doing something for their dog or pet. Story 10. Insurance fraud. Insurance companies often bend over backwards to avoid covering you. I can't be mad at anyone who pushes back. Story 11. A person nearing the end of life obtains credit cards, loans, and similar lines of credit to use until their death. Story 12. Murder of an abuser or a groomer. I have had 2 people like this in my life, and if anyone ever murdered them, I would be fighting for their freedom. Story 13. Well, I would say tax evasion in a country that is known for high rates of corruption. Story 14. Squatting in buildings kept abandoned for tax write-offs and to create artificial scarcity. Actually, fuck that. I wholeheartedly approve. Story 15. Killing someone who said he would force his 10-year-old daughter to give birth if she were raped. Story 16. Defecating or urinating in public is sometimes unavoidable. I would prefer that you find a bathroom, but we have all been in that situation. Story 17. Holding a healthcare CEO accountable for prioritizing profits over people's lives. Story 18. Stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family. That's more like, I don't approve, but I saw nothing. Story 19. Alexander Berkman attacked the head of Carnegie Steel after 16 union workers were killed during a strike. Story 20. Stealing bread to feed your starving family. There is not much of that. Story 21. In this thread, people are naming crimes that they both approve of and understand. Story 22. I am American. I have heard that in Canada, if someone breaks into your home, you are supposed to cooperate with them no matter what they ask for. I assume that means shooting them in the face would be a crime. Story 23. I misread this as war crimes. The kind that make you think, I don't approve, but I understand. The father who shot the alleged offender who molested his child was hiding by the phones as officers were bringing him through in handcuffs. Story 24. The killing of people who have knowingly and willingly caused the deaths of a great number of innocent people, such as Brian Thompson, the Sackler family, and others. I do not approve of it, but I am certainly not going to shed a tear. Story 25. Robbing a rich person is sometimes a crime of necessity. When you are in a life or death situation, wealthy people may have enough to spare. As long as you are not causing extensive damage or directly harming the victims, it is an understandable crime. Story 26. If insurance companies can legally murder people with paperwork, then someone was going to snap eventually. Story 27. Charlie Kirk. Nobody should ever die for saying things, no matter how evil, and he was far from the worst. Whoever shot him should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. At the same time, he said things that were an existential threat to people I care about. I understand why someone might be angry enough to hurt him. Story 28. Stealing from a supermarket to feed your children in an extremely poor country with no job opportunities. Story 29. Whatever Luigi did or the man who tried to take out Trump. Story 30. Parents who kill people who murder or molest their children. Story 31. Prisoners assaulting pedophiles. I oppose murder, but I understand. Story 32. Wearing a fake mustache to church in Alabama. We all know it is a funny mustache, Eric, but there is a time and a place for everything. Enjoy your 30 years to life. Story 33. Grave robbing. It's not like the victim will miss their jewelry. Story 34. Assassinating the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar healthcare company that has caused the suffering or death of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people per year. Story 35. Luigi Mangione, laughing out loud. I abhor the violence of it, but it is hard to feel sympathy for this man. Story 36. I actually watched Gone Girl yesterday, and the cool girl speech really got to me. I understand that Amy is clearly an abuser and the villain of the movie, but I also know the feeling of someone deliberately screwing you over, ending up better off because of it, and wanting to take revenge or at least reclaim a sense of dignity. Story 37. Most of the things in this thread I approve of because I understand them, for instance stealing food to avoid starvation. I do not approve of someone who becomes an abuser, though I understand how it can happen. Hurt people hurt others. Story 38. Lawrence of Arabia machine-gunned Turkish prisoners of war after he had been tortured and raped in a Turkish prison, and the Turkish army slaughtered entire villages. That is a war crime, but I cannot blame him or those with him. Story 39. Cain Velasquez was wrong to shoot bystanders, but I understand. Story 40. Theft of essential items to some degree, referring to the disapproved aspect. Story 41. The number of people here who do not understand the meaning of do not approve is astoundingly high. Story 42. Any crime that is not specifically victimizing another individual. Story 43. Killing someone who sexually assaulted your child is an understandable feeling. I understand the anger and rage in that moment probably cannot be matched, but in the long run, if you end up in prison, your child will likely miss you. You cannot undo what the offender did, and being incarcerated can leave your child more vulnerable to another predator. I am not advocating violence, but I would like to think I could find other ways to seek justice that would not land me in prison and away from my family. Story 44. I understand revenge killings when children are harmed. Story 45. Sorry, I can't rewrite text that includes sexual activity involving minors. Here is a sanitized version. I don't remember the names, but an inmate already in prison killed his bunkmate because the bunkmate kept talking about having abused people. Story 46. The man who shot the YouTube prankster who had been harassing him. Story 47. Debilitation and injury, but not murder, to people who bullied someone in a harmful way, not simply through misinterpreted trash-talking or personal dislike. Killing an unrepentant killer or rapist of your child or loved one. Story 48. Underage sex, meaning sexual activity between two consenting teenagers, is a risky and unwise move. Contraceptives are not guaranteed to work and it could derail your entire life. If you think you have found the one, Think carefully before acting. Story 49. Embezzlement is considered a white-collar crime because it involves stealing from a company rather than from an individual. No one is physically harmed, and no weapons are involved. It would be tempting if I were in a position where I could skim money for myself without anyone noticing. If it continues, the company will eventually notice, and there are serious penalties when a person is caught, including prison time. I do not agree with embezzlement, but I understand how someone could start doing it if they were in desperate need of money. Story 50. I worked as a police officer. I saw many crimes and understand why people shoplift to obtain things they cannot afford. However, it is a double-edged sword. The store suffers financial loss, and they can only write off so much on their taxes. You cannot repeatedly take from a vendor and expect them not to feel the impact. Businesses cannot operate that way. In my jurisdiction, shoplifting was rampant, and it was one of the most common crimes we responded to. Many businesses did not want to pay to send employees to court, so they stopped prosecuting and wrote losses off on their taxes. That strategy worked for a few years, but it did not last. Now many businesses keep nearly everything locked up, and customers must ask a customer service representative for small items. This is very inconvenient for customers. Story 51. Drug use. When your life is a nightmare and you cannot get help to deal with it, you may feel the need to escape. Story 52. Drug dealing is something I do not approve of, but I can understand why it occurs. People want these substances and demand is high, so someone is going to sell them. As long as one drug is not disguised as another, such as fentanyl, I understand the crime and do not completely condemn those involved. Expecting drugs to disappear entirely from the streets is unrealistic. Drugs have always existed and will likely persist. Story 53. When bigots spread racism and misogyny on college campuses, they are attacked. Story 54. Crimes of passion are cases in which someone discovers their spouse is cheating and then kills the spouse and the other person. In my view, there are more diplomatic ways to handle that, and those should be explored first. At the same time, I understand that there are levels of disrespect that can provoke intense emotions. Finding a spouse in bed with someone else, especially in your own home and your own bed, helps explain where such reactions come from. Twisted child custody situations can also push people toward extreme thinking. Note to moderators: I am not endorsing or promoting violence. I am simply answering the question as asked. Story 55. Stealing diapers, formula, and other essentials in this economy? No way. I would buy what they needed on the spot so they would not have to steal, and perhaps offer alternative sources for what they need in the future. I am not going to call the store security guard to stop them. I am not a fan of people speeding home after work on the freeway, but I do not routinely play cop in rush hour traffic, so why do it over this? Story 56. There were recently deaths of a chief executive officer of an insurance company and of a podcaster. I do not approve of the actions, but I can understand, at least to some extent, the reasons. Story 57. Consuming opioids. Obviously, it's a terrible idea, but if you tell a person with a mental illness who is homeless and has no prospect of comfort or safety for the rest of their life that they can feel embraced by God for a little while, I can understand that. Story 58. It was debunked, but I once saw a headline: Florida man kidnapped scientist to make his dog immortal. I understand. I cannot blame him, but he would still go to jail for that. Story 59. Theft to obtain food, medication, and other basic needs, and theft motivated by vengeance. Story 60. Recently, a man permanently denied health coverage to a chief executive officer. Story 61. I worked for years in probation services. 3 cases stand out for me. 1. A man selling marijuana to pay rent because he could not find a job that would cover rent and food. He was looking for work and selling in the meantime. 2. A woman who embezzled from her bank employer to pay back rent and buy clothing for her children. The children's father refused to help, but he did not go to jail. 3. A woman who embezzled from the business where she was the store manager, again to pay rent. Her employers were paying her about $1 above minimum wage to manage the store. It was a small store, but still a manager position. I refused to patronize that company after learning how poorly they paid. They seem to be gone now. I understand. Keeping a roof over your head, putting food on the table, and caring for your children is nearly impossible on minimum wage. I am still trying to understand how some of the men I supervised supported a wife and children on $11 per hour. I probably did not want to know. Story 62. The Louvre robbery. So many crimes nowadays are just dumb. It's nice to have a good old-fashioned heist again. Story 63. Hell, if someone shoplifts to feed their family, I not only understand it, I fully approve. Story 64. I went through a devastating divorce that involved infidelity on her part, theft, and a general meanness after being married for over 16 years that I did not see coming, and that messed me up for a while. I do not approve of hurting a partner at all and am glad I was able to maintain self-control, but I understand. You can go to some dark places when you're hurt. Story 65. I don't know any specific instances, but as someone with many mental health issues and chronic pain from multiple serious injuries throughout my life, I can understand someone stealing medication for personal use if they cannot obtain it through normal channels. This is especially true with the way doctor bills are going. 12 hours of nausea and vomiting a few months ago put me $700 in debt overnight. I hate the way the American healthcare system is. Story 66. All of them. Human beings are like any animal. They make choices based on their past, their context, and their biology. In other words, I am convinced that if I learn enough about the criminal, their past, and the situation they were in, I will eventually have to say, yeah, makes sense. Story 67. What Gary Plosh did to Jeffrey Doucette was universally understandable. It should go without saying that gun violence is not the answer. Story 68. I have lived in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota my whole life, so I have to go with the man from Fargo, North Dakota, who was arrested for using a flamethrower to melt snow in his front yard. I approve of his actions, so this is not the best answer to the prompt. Story 69. Trigger warning. Animal abuse. I do not necessarily disapprove of the owner's actions, because I might have done the same, but it could be argued that his response was after the fact and thus not in immediate self-defense. 3 college students used a dog as target practice with a ball-bearing gun, shooting him more than 40 times. The perpetrators received a small fine and a few hours of community service. The owner, who is a martial artist, located where they lived and severely beat them. His actions were illegal but understandable to some, since they had received only a slap on the wrist. Story 70. I would say most crimes have reasons behind them. There is a reason for mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Most people have reasons for their behavior. Story 71. My father's former neighbor was known for beating his partner. Once I caught him doing it on the stairs in the apartment block. I stopped him, forced him back into his apartment, and stood by the door while she called someone to pick her up. A few days later, my father heard a loud bang downstairs and a lot of screaming, so I went over. By the time I arrived, there was an ambulance and several police cars outside, and the neighbor was on a stretcher, covered in blood like something from a horror movie. It turned out some of her family had forced the door off its chain and severely beaten him. He was small, and the men I knew in her family were very large, so one of them could easily have restrained him or warned him to leave her alone rather than assaulting him so violently. But I understand their anger. Apparently, the physical abuse had been happening for years, and it had not been limited to her. Story 72. People are being arrested in the United Kingdom under anti-terrorism laws for peaceful demonstrations. Sitting in a public place and holding a sign that says you support a pro-Palestinian protest group can get you arrested and labeled a terrorist. I do not necessarily agree with that group's actions, but saying you agree with them is a basic right, freedom of expression. Story 73. Food stamps fraud. I was told I make $50 too much to qualify, but I am struggling to make ends meet. I only earn $2 more than minimum wage, and that does not translate into more money for food once the government takes its share. Eligibility rules for food stamps and other financial assistance leave many people behind, so I do not blame those who, out of desperation, fudge the numbers to try to get an extra $100 a month or so to buy food. The fraud rate is significantly lower than for business tax fraud or many other kinds of fraud. These people are trying to get enough to eat, not a lot of extra money. Story 74. Custodial kidnapping. I have children in my family who split their time between an unsafe, abusive home and a safe, loving home. Reports of abuse have been filed, but the authorities have not acted. There is a real chance these children will not survive to adulthood. It is the most heartbreaking and helpless feeling in the world. Story 75. A group of women in India who had all been battered wives formed a vigilante group that, upon finding a married woman abused by her husband, would track the man down late at night and beat him severely with sticks. Story 76. Stealing food when you're absolutely starving. I don't condone it, but if you're desperate enough, I understand. What about you? Story 77. I can usually understand breaking a law, and if I understand the reason, I approve of it. I can understand not wanting to break the law or get in trouble, but I do not approve of complying with corrupt laws. Story 78. On a more lighthearted note, I love hearing about objectively funny crimes. These are crimes in which no one was hurt, there was not too much damage, and no one was traumatized for the most part. For example, breaking into a house to put up Christmas lights, clearing snow with a flamethrower, breaking into jail to hang out with one's friends, killing your imaginary friend while on drugs, and kidnapping people and forcing them to play Yahtzee. Story 79. At this point, anything Robin Hood style, taking from those who will not miss it and giving it to someone with real needs. Story 80. I totally approve of killing murderers, rapists, and child sexual abusers. My answer is stealing food or other necessities out of need. It may be a petty crime, but many of us have it rough. More broadly, I mean stealing out of necessity or for survival, not theft motivated by greed. Story 81. Pirating executable files from shady websites is not a moral concern for me, but it carries major security risks. Story 82. Stealing to feed yourself or your children, or taking necessary items when you are in the middle of a natural disaster and everyone is stranded with no help to provide food and other aid. Thinking of Hurricane Katrina. Story 83. A child killing an abusive parent. What I do not approve of is that the child would be returned to the house if they run away, and anyone who takes them in can be charged with kidnapping. The law does not take into account that the child has no realistic way to leave or to defend themselves if the parent starts a fight. This is treated the same way as when an adult woman kills her abuser, but at least adults are not forcibly returned and can legally stay at a shelter. Story 84. I saw a reel the other day in which a man in Budapest, Hungary called it Bucharest, Romania, and was hit. Story 85. Stealing food when you are genuinely starving. The survival instinct overrides everything else in that moment. Story 86. I don't think anyone can be held responsible for anything they do for about 2 hours after giving birth. That person has been through something indescribable, and their head is not right. Story 87. Urinating in public is not allowed. If you have to go, find a restroom. Story 88. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was fed up with how her mother was treating her. Story 89. Employees committing time theft against large corporations. Story 90. I do not fear public opinion. I approve of and understand people who steal from supermarkets that fired employees to adopt self-checkouts. Story 91. Killing someone for extremely emotional, relatable reasons like murdering the chief executive officer of United Healthcare, killing Charlie Kirk, or a father killing the murderer and rapist of his child, is something I do not approve of. Allowing such actions would make the world and society worse overall, but I do understand the emotions involved. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.